When discussing literature, the term contradiction has a pretty negative connotation, being associated with plot holes, unbalanced characters, and a lack of continuity. But let's talk about a story that leaps over this pitfall, and actually uses contradiction to feed the complexity of its characters and narrative, create meaningful messages, and foster a rare sense of realism. Shouwa Genroku Rakugo Shinjuu was the standout of the winter 2016 season for me. It's incredibly refreshing to see a series like this. It's definitely not a show for everyone, an obstacle only reinforced by its target demographic of josei, but I would highly recommend it if you're looking for a dramatic historical piece that develops its characters wonderfully and explores many different societal and human issues. The way Shouwa is structured, having a first episode dedicated entirely to Yotaro and depicting an elderly Kikuhiko, and then diving into the meat of the story in the post-war period, is a clue to the way in which it wants its viewers to understand the narrative. We already know how Kikuhiko's story is going to end. He chooses to be a traditionalist, and Tsukeroku dies. This contextualizes his younger years in a way that, without that first episode, would be impossible. It tells us that, though Shouwa is very intimate in the way it presents its characters, it doesn't want its viewers to forget that the series as a whole is looking at Rakugo, and those who perform it, from a wider viewpoint. After all, Kikuhiko's story is just half of the manga. Shouwa uses this greater context to feed its characters. Rakugo, and consequently art in general, is a conduit for emotion, for self-discovery, for purpose and meaning. Perhaps its most applicable purpose is catharsis. Kikuhiko and Tsukeroku both practice Rakugo for very different reasons, and the ways they derive and search for meaning through Rakugo are incredibly different. Out of this contrast comes an important question. Why do we create and perform art? Is it for fame? Is it out of respect for tradition? Or is it simply to fill a void? But, to go back to the topic of this video, the highest level of the story in which we can find contradiction is in the tone of the series itself. The following point is very simple. Rakugo, even more so presently than in the past, is primarily a comedic performance. And while there are definitely numerous Rakugo stories that are not funny in nature, they are still more often than not ironic. The classic Shinigami, which is performed by Kikuhiko 2 times in the series, is portrayed as incredibly serious, ominous, foreboding. But that is mainly a result of Kikuhiko's interpretation and the story's representation of it. In modern performances of Shinigami, as far as in the videos of it I found, there is an air of comedy about the bleak situation the story recounts. The audiences laugh. In the first episode, Konatsu tells Yotaro how jovial Tsukeroku's version of Shinigami was. The jazz that plays over much of the series contradicts the tradition of Rakugo, developing a sense of changing times while it paradoxically plays over classic Japanese storytelling. Shouwa is not, in any capacity, a comedy, and this is in stark contrast to Rakugo as it exists in reality. And this makes sense. Because Shouwa is not just a simple portrayal of actual Rakugo, it's more than that. And this contradiction in the tone of Shouwa is important. It speaks to a disconnect between Kikuhiko and the art as a whole. The second level where we can see contradiction is in the Rakugo society that Kikuhiko and Tsukeroku are members of. Yakumo tells Kikuhiko to perfect his Rakugo by ensuring it has flaws. The masters, for how respected they are rarely shown performing. We never get the opportunity to see what their Rakugo really is. They're faceless to us, and in turn faceless to Tsukeroku and Kikuhiko. These two, whom the association comes to hold as the assurers of Rakugo's future, are relatively estranged from it. Kikuhiko remarks in the final episode that his position keeps changing even though he doesn't. Both he and Tsukeroku detach themselves from their organization, and yet, in the later years, Kikuhiko is still a part of it. He's just been elected the president. And in the same vein, Tsukeroku is forced to stop performing by the organization. Rakugo is not really an ancient, venerable art form. In fact, compared to various other Japanese and Eastern styles of performance, it's quite young and had evolved greatly before the World Wars. While it does have a lineage dating back over 10 centuries, the Rakugo that is shown in the series, performed by the masters, is not old by any means. In fact, the term Rakugo, fallen words, was not used to commonly describe this form of performance until after the First World War. And with this context in mind, it's easy to see how the Rakugo society in Shouwa is contradictory, and perhaps even hypocritical. They ardently try to hold on to their established idea of Rakugo, while not recognizing that Rakugo has had to change continuously over time already. And this is an easy trap to fall into when concerning any type of society. On a wider scale, there is a clear progression towards an ideal that may not yet exist. What may have seemed radical at an earlier date regularly becomes the norm. We are constrained by our ultimately short time on this earth. The final and most important level of contrast and contradiction is within the characters. For the entirety of its runtime, Shouwa plays a dangerous game with Kikuhiko, balancing his characteristics on a fence. His traits mirror the waves of traditionalism and modernism that clash in the series. Many of his actions and mannerisms are contradicting. His clothing is Western, while his Rakugo is very conservative. He is extremely effeminate. Various characters remark at his woman-like appearance and manner throughout the story, yet he staunchly believes that women shouldn't perform Rakugo. These conflicting traits do a couple things. Firstly, they allow Kikuhiko to be placed at the center of the chaos in the story. For the majority of the series, he exists as the tether between two worlds, between the traditionalism that the Rakugo establishment is trying to hold on to and the rapidly changing social climate of post-World War II Japan. Secondly, they feed into what makes Kikuhiko such a well-rounded and believable person. He's a young man caught between a childhood growing up in Imperial Japan, practicing traditional Japanese art forms, and yet he's still intrigued and pulled along by the fast flow of emerging Westernism, at least during the flashback portion of the story. And Tsukeroku is representative of this societal change, but quite beautifully not in a clear-cut Western culture is better type of attitude. He is a representation of liberal reaction to change on a conceptual level instead of, say, a proponent of the social changes in the story. Because in a way, Tsukeroku is even more loyal to Rakugo than Kikuhiko is. Tsukeroku's goal when concerning Rakugo is always how to sustain it in a changing world. His conversations with Kikuhiko, especially at the jazz cafe, speak to this. Tsukeroku is a true performer at heart, and for him that means connecting to his audience. There's a fierce dichotomy between why these two men are so attached to Rakugo. Tsukeroku wants to extend the reach of Rakugo to more people, and to connect with others while also adapting the art to suit new situations. The shot composition and cutting of his performances are so vibrant and so connected to the audience when compared against Kikuhiko's more introspective, softer performances. But, as with Kikuhiko, Tsukeroku has contrasting traits within his characterization as well. He deliberately embeds himself in the present with his drunken, fun-filled nights, while also looking towards the future through his progressive philosophy for Rakugo. Kikuhiko says in episode 4, Tsukeroku isn't a storyteller's name. And this is interesting in multiple ways. Tsukeroku is something different from everyone else, and yet he is arguably more of a storyteller, more a true Rakugoka than anyone else. Kikuhiko's reason for practicing Rakugo is that he simply wants a purpose. At the beginning of his life, he has to give up dancing, and his replacement for it is Rakugo. He tries to keep to himself for most of the series, trying to perfect his own Rakugo. But when he goes to find Tsukeroku, he conveys a different feeling to us. He actually needs people in the same way Rakugo needs people. He leaves very quickly to find Tsukeroku after Yakumo dies, not just because he doesn't want to inherit the name of his master, but also because he actually doesn't want to be alone. His final months with Tsukeroku are supposed to be the culmination of his character arc when he finally realizes that he can lead a fulfilling life with Tsukeroku and Miyokichi beside him. In the moments before the deaths of Tsukeroku and Miyokichi, he reaches that attachment and connection. And when they die, he is left absolutely alone. Everyone is gone. He has nothing left but himself. And this is why Shouwa is a tragedy. Because just when Kikuhiko is finally ready to admit that he's lying to himself, his vessels of understanding are taken from him. We can see in the first and final episodes through the small audiences and the remarks of the characters that Kikuhiko has not done a good job sustaining Rakugo. And I think this is because he hasn't changed ever since those fateful deaths. The change that Rakugo needed died when Tsukeroku died. Why does Kikuhiko fixate himself on Shinigami? It's a classic, but it's somber. A warning against greed. He says, at the end of his performance in episode 10, "This is the solitude I have longed for." This is why he doesn't want the title of Yakumo. Because he knows that his Rakugo is for him and him alone, and that if it falls to him to continue Rakugo, he will never succeed in the way that Tsukeroku could. But he ends up the heir anyways. That, in itself, is an ironic farce. The Rakugo establishment, in trying to preserve tradition, all but assured the death of the form. Shouwa frames connection as sacrificial. Tsukeroku, connected to so many others, dies. Rakugo, pulled along by the changes in Japanese society, fades. But Kikuhiko, disconnected from others and living just for himself, survives at the expense of his friend and his practice. For all its beautiful contrasts and contradictions, perhaps because of them, Shouwa isn't about extremes, and it doesn't portray a single side of the spectrum as better than the other. After all, Tsukeroku dresses exclusively in Japanese clothing in the same way that Kikuhiko dresses in a Western style. I think that in respect to the disparate ways in which Kikuhiko and Tsukeroku dress compared to their Rakugo philosophies, Shouwa is making a statement about how we aren't as clear-cut as we think we are. And that's something that a lot of films and anime fail to express when developing their characters, because it's easier to make a one-dimensional character. In closing, Tsukeroku's many interactions with Kikuhiko aren't necessarily beneficial, but they're not bad either. They're just there, and I think that's beautiful. It's realistic. A friend doesn't just do good for you. They mess you up, they make you clean up their messes. And it's in this give-and-take relationship that these two men found solidarity through difference. Hey guys, thanks for watching the video. It's been a while since I uploaded, but there's at least one show from the season I want to talk about, and that video should be out in a week or 2, or 3, or never. You know how bad I am with deadlines. Anyways, thanks for watching, and see you later.